Before Johnny Carson passed away, he quietly opened up about secrets he had carried for decades. Truths about some of Hollywood's biggest stars that could have destroyed entire careers if revealed during their time. For more than 30 years, Carson had been America's trusted late-night companion, a man who laughed, listened, and made everyone, from movie icons to political figures, feel comfortable on his Tonight Show couch. But behind the charming smiles and witty banter, he was hiding knowledge that could have shocked the entire entertainment world. A former Tonight Show producer once said, "Johnny knew everything." When stars came on the show and talked about their marriages, their romances, and their perfect lives, Carson would often smile quietly, fully aware that many of these stories were nothing more than Hollywood fabrications. The public saw glitz and glamour, but Johnny saw fear and pressure. People trapped by an industry that demanded perfection and punished authenticity. In his later years, as Carson became more reflective about his life and legacy, he began to confide in close friends about what he had witnessed. He talked about the pain of seeing people forced to live lies, especially those whose real sexual identities were hidden behind fake marriages and public images created by studios. During the mid-20th century, being openly gay in Hollywood wasn't just difficult, it was career suicide. Exposure could end everything: fame, money, reputation, and sometimes even personal safety. These weren't just secrets, they were lifelines. Among the stories Carson shared, one of the most shocking involved Rock Hudson, the man who defined Hollywood romance. Hudson was tall, handsome, and effortlessly charming, the perfect leading man of the 1950s and 60s. He starred opposite actresses like Doris Day, melting hearts across America. Women dreamed of him, and men wanted to be him. But the truth, known quietly by Carson and others in the industry, was that Hudson's public image was an illusion carefully built by Universal Studios to hide his homosexuality. According to those who worked with Carson, every time Hudson appeared on The Tonight Show, there was an unspoken tension. Both men knew the truth, but both also knew the risk. Carson never once hinted at it on air, not out of fear, but out of respect and empathy. It was an open secret in Hollywood circles that Hudson was gay, but exposure at that time would have destroyed him. Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson, even arranged a marriage between Hudson and his own secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955, to keep rumors quiet. The marriage lasted only 3 years, but it gave Hudson the appearance of normality that the studios demanded. Carson later described these kinds of lavender marriages as a form of institutional lying, fabrications, created not by the stars themselves, but by the industry around them. He wasn't judgmental about anyone's sexuality, but he found the deception deeply unsettling. As someone who valued honesty and connection, the act of participating in these fictions night after night weighed on him. He saw firsthand how Hollywood's obsession with image crushed individuality. When Rock Hudson passed away in 1985 due to AIDS-related complications, it was a turning point. His death was tragic and transformative. It forced the public to confront truths that had been hidden for decades. Carson was said to be heartbroken, not just by Hudson's death, but by what it represented. He saw Hudson as a victim of a cruel system that denied people the right to be authentic. It made Johnny reflect deeply on how entertainment, fame, and deception were intertwined in ways that caused real suffering. Another star Carson spoke about with quiet sadness was Cary Grant, the man who embodied charm and sophistication for generations. With his smooth voice, tailored suits, and effortless wit, Grant was the picture of perfection. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention. Yet Carson knew that the real Cary Grant, born Archibald Leach in England, was living a very different kind of life than the one the world saw. For years, Grant shared a home with fellow actor Randolph Scott, a ruggedly handsome Western star. They lived together in a Santa Monica beach house that Hollywood insiders jokingly called Bachelor Hall. There were even magazine spreads showing them cooking breakfast, relaxing in robes and lounging by the pool, images that, by today's standards, clearly portrayed an intimate relationship. But at the time, the studio system managed to pass them off as just 2 bachelors sharing expenses. Cary Grant went on to marry 5 women over the course of his life. But many historians and people close to him have described these marriages as convenient arrangements designed to maintain his public image. Carson knew all of this and found it both fascinating and heartbreaking. He admired Grant's talent and sophistication, but was deeply struck by the psychological toll of living a double life. Grant's charm, his confidence, his entire persona, these weren't just traits. They were a mask he had created to survive in a world that wouldn't accept him as he truly was. As Carson aged, he became increasingly uncomfortable with his own role in perpetuating these illusions. The Tonight Show was a cornerstone of American entertainment, but it was also part of the machinery that kept these fictions alive. The host began to see that he, too, had contributed to the myth-making of Hollywood, a system that valued appearances over truth and punished vulnerability. The story of Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy was another example of this hidden world. To the public, they were Hollywood's greatest love story, a 26-year romance filled with devotion, sacrifice, and artistic partnership. But Carson, who had interviewed Hepburn multiple times, knew that their relationship was far more complex. He came to believe that their bond was more about protection and convenience than passion. Tracy, a devout Catholic, never divorced his wife, and Hepburn's partnership with him offered her both privacy and respectability. It explained why such a brilliant, independent woman never married, while also shielding her from speculation about her sexuality. Hepburn had long, close relationships with women, including Laura Harding and later Phyllis Wilborn. Many who knew her personally believed these were not just friendships, but lifelong partnerships. Carson admired Hepburn deeply, not for the fiction the studios created, but for how she navigated her life with quiet dignity. She refused to play by Hollywood's social rules. She lived in Connecticut and New York, away from the spotlight, and dressed in a way that defied expectations. Her trousers, minimal makeup, and straightforward manner were her subtle rebellion against a world that wanted to define her. To Carson, she was an example of someone who had managed to stay true to herself, at least partially, within an industry built on deception. He often reflected on how Hepburn's supposed romance with Tracy served as one of Hollywood's greatest cover stories. It was a legend so powerful that it became truth in the eyes of millions. Even decades later, the story of their great love overshadowed the reality that both had used the arrangement to protect their personal lives. Carson saw it as one of the most successful pieces of myth-making in Hollywood history. Then there was Marlon Brando, a man whose performances were celebrated for their raw truth and intensity. Brando was unpredictable, passionate, and undeniably talented. From A Streetcar Named Desire to The Godfather, he changed acting forever. On screen, he was the ultimate symbol of masculinity. But off-screen, Carson knew that Brando's personal life was much more complicated. Brando's reputation was built on honesty and realism, yet his private life was wrapped in secrecy. The public saw him as a ladies' man with numerous wives and relationships with women, but those close to him knew that Brando's sexuality was fluid. He had relationships with both men and women, though this was carefully hidden during the height of his fame. In the 1950s and 60s, studios worked hard to maintain his heterosexual image. Carson found the contradiction fascinating. Here was a man who made a career out of emotional truth, yet he was forced to conceal his own identity. In later years, Brando became more open, even admitting in interviews that he had been involved with men. But during his prime, that kind of honesty would have ended his career. Carson saw Brando as a symbol of how even the most authentic-seeming performers were trapped by the expectations of their era. There were even rumors of a relationship between Brando and James Dean, another actor who, like Brando, helped redefine what masculinity looked like on screen. Both men were rebellious, intense, and emotionally raw. Carson often remarked to close friends about the irony that two of Hollywood's most powerful symbols of male strength may have shared a truth that could never be publicly acknowledged. What fascinated Carson most was how deeply these deceptions were woven into Hollywood's very structure. Studios arranged marriages, suppressed rumors, and crafted stories that the public eagerly consumed. Every glossy magazine cover and red carpet interview was part of a performance, not just by the stars, but by the entire entertainment machine. As Johnny Carson grew older, these stories weighed on him. He had spent his life making people laugh and helping them forget their troubles. Yet behind the laughter, he saw pain, fear, and loneliness in the very people the world worshipped. He began to realize that fame often came at the cost of authenticity. Many of the stars who appeared confident and glamorous were quietly living in fear of being exposed. In private conversations, Carson reportedly said he didn't blame them. They were products of their time, people who had to make impossible choices between truth and survival. But what saddened him most was how much humanity was lost in the process. The public adored these stars for who they pretended to be, not who they truly were. Johnny Carson carried these stories until the end of his life. To the world, he was the charming host who made every celebrity feel at ease. But privately, he saw the cracks beneath Hollywood's perfect surface, the lonely people behind the laughter, the carefully arranged romances, and the truths that could never be spoken aloud. When he finally opened up to those closest to him, it wasn't to gossip or sensationalize. It was to share his deep empathy for those who lived their lives in the shadows of their own success. In the end, Johnny Carson's reflections weren't just about scandal, they were about compassion. He saw the pain that came from pretending, the exhaustion of living a lie, and the heavy cost of fame. To him, these weren't just Hollywood secrets. They were stories about humanity, fear, and the longing to be accepted for who we really are. And that understanding, quiet, thoughtful, and deeply human, was perhaps the truest part of Johnny Carson's legacy. Johnny Carson often reflected on the difference between public image and private reality, and this theme became especially clear when he thought about stars like James Dean. Dean's short but powerful career had been surrounded by rumors about what really went on behind the scenes in Hollywood. He only appeared in 3 major movies before his tragic death in a car crash at the age of 24. But those roles in East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant turned him into a symbol of restless youth and emotional honesty. For many young people of the 1950s, he was the face of rebellion, the misunderstood outsider who refused to play by society's rules. But Johnny Carson, who never met Dean but heard many stories from insiders, learned things that made him uneasy. According to those close to Carson, he was troubled by rumors that Dean had been involved in secret relationships with powerful men in Hollywood, possibly as a way to get ahead in the cutthroat film industry. These whispers painted Dean not just as a rebel, but also as a young man trying to survive, a world where power often came at a personal cost. Carson found it sad that someone who had become an icon of honesty and independence might have had to compromise himself just to succeed. He didn't blame Dean, though. He blamed the system that forced talented young people to make painful choices in order to survive. In private conversations, Carson would often say that the tragedy wasn't just Dean's early death, but also the way his death had frozen his image forever. Because Dean died young, his fans never saw him age, struggle, or face scandals. He became a permanent symbol of youthful rebellion, untouched by the messy realities of fame. Carson saw this as another example of how Hollywood could reshape reality to serve its own needs. Death had turned Dean from a real person with flaws into a mythic figure, and the rumors that could have ruined him in life became part of his mysterious legend in death. Johnny Carson also found himself thinking about Marlene Dietrich, one of the most fascinating women ever to come out of Hollywood. Dietrich, with her sultry voice, sharp style, and daring personality, brought a new kind of sophistication to American cinema. From her first major role in The Blue Angel, to her later collaborations with the director Josef von Sternberg, she built a carefully crafted image of mystery and independence. She wore men's suits, spoke her mind, and carried herself with a kind of effortless confidence that made her seem untouchable. When Carson interviewed her on The Tonight Show, he was deeply impressed. He admired how honest she was about herself, even though she lived in a time when being openly different could end a career. Unlike many of her peers, Dietrich never fully hid her attraction to both men and women. She was married to Rudolf Sieber for decades, but their marriage was more of a partnership than a traditional romance. Both had relationships outside the marriage, and both seemed to accept it. Carson found her courage remarkable. She managed to turn what others might see as scandal into part of her allure. Her European background gave her a kind of freedom that American stars didn't have. People expected her to be unconventional, and she used that expectation to her advantage. Dietrich's style blurred the line between masculinity and femininity, and instead of being punished for it, she became even more admired. Johnny saw her as someone who mastered the art of being herself without apology, and he respected that deeply. She had created her own space in a world full of rigid expectations. Carson often said that she represented something rare in Hollywood, a person who lived truthfully while still playing the game just enough to survive it. Her story stood out as an example of how authenticity could coexist with artistry, if handled with intelligence and grace. Then there was Raymond Burr, a man whose on-screen roles made him one of the most respected and recognizable figures on television. Millions knew him as Perry Mason, the brilliant defense lawyer who always uncovered the truth, or as Robert Ironside, the sharp detective in a wheelchair. Off-screen, however, Burr's real life was built on an elaborate lie. When Carson interviewed him, he played along with the stories Burr told, even though some of them didn't quite add up. Burr claimed to have been married multiple times, to have lost his wife and son in a tragic plane crash, and to have served bravely in World War II. But none of it was true. Every part of his supposed past had been invented to protect his secret. He was a gay man living in an era when that truth could have destroyed his career. Johnny often reflected on how sad that was. Here was a man who spent his life portraying justice and truth, yet was forced to live behind a carefully built mask because the truth about who he really was could have ended everything. Burr had to keep track of fake marriages, fake family tragedies, even fake war stories just to seem normal in the eyes of the public. Carson thought about how exhausting that must have been, to constantly act even when the cameras weren't rolling. In private, Burr lived quietly with his partner, Robert Benavides, whom he met on the set of Perry Mason in 1960. They spent decades together, running a vineyard and orchid business, living a full life in private, but pretending to be just friends in public. To Johnny, this was one of the saddest examples of what Hollywood demanded from its stars. Burr's death eventually allowed his true story to emerge, but the decades of secrecy and emotional strain left a lasting impression on Carson. He often said that Burr's story showed just how high the price of fame could be for anyone who didn't fit society's expectations. Another couple whose story fascinated Carson was Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. Both were incredibly talented actors who had long and successful careers. Laughton was known for unforgettable roles in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution, while Lanchester became immortal as the Bride of Frankenstein. On the surface, they seemed like the perfect Hollywood couple, married for over 30 years until Laughton's death in 1962. But according to the stories Carson heard from people in the industry, both were hiding something that Hollywood could never have accepted at the time. Laughton was said to be gay, and Lanchester was rumored to be lesbian. Their marriage, while not romantic, gave them both the social protection they needed to continue working. Carson found their relationship surprisingly touching rather than deceptive. He saw it as a creative partnership between two people who genuinely cared for and respected each other, even if they weren't romantically involved. They built a life together based on friendship, mutual support, and a shared understanding of the challenges they faced. In an industry that demanded everyone fit a particular image, they managed to find a balance that allowed them both to survive and even thrive. Lanchester never publicly confirmed these rumors, even in her autobiography, but she also didn't deny that their marriage was complicated. She simply described Laughton as a difficult husband and moved on. Carson admired her discretion. He saw their story as an example of how people in that era used intelligence and loyalty to protect themselves from a world that gave them no other choice. To him, their marriage wasn't fake. It was a deeply practical kind of love built on shared purpose, rather than traditional romance. Finally, there was Tyrone Power, one of the most handsome men to ever appear on screen. His face and charm made him one of 20th Century Fox's most bankable stars during the 1930s and 1940s. He played daring heroes in films like The Mark of Zorro and Blood and Sand, and he showed real dramatic range in Witness for the Prosecution. To the public, he was the perfect matinee idol, the dream man every woman wanted. But behind the scenes, there were stories that his life was far more complicated. Carson, who never met him because Power died before The Tonight Show began, heard many of these stories from guests who had known him personally. They described a man who lived a double life, keeping his relationships with men hidden while allowing the studio's publicity department to create a fantasy of romantic affairs with actresses. Carson found it fascinating how perfectly Power balanced both worlds. He married actresses like Annabella and Linda Christian, which helped maintain the image his fans expected. But according to Hollywood insiders, these marriages also served as protective shields. What moved Johnny most was that these relationships weren't entirely fake. There was affection, there were children, and there were moments of genuine connection. But underneath it all was a deep sense of limitation. Power's breathtaking beauty had made him a star, but it also trapped him. His looks were both his blessing and his curse. Everyone adored the image, but few ever saw the man behind it. Carson often said that the more beautiful a star was, the less freedom they had. Tyrone Power's appearance gave him everything: fame, wealth, admiration, but it also took away his right to be himself. His sudden death at 44 from a heart attack ended his life before he could ever see a time when being honest about who you were might not ruin your career. To Johnny, Power represented the tragedy of perfection, the idea that beauty could make someone untouchable and yet completely trapped at the same time. When Carson thought about all these stories, James Dean's haunting myth, Dietrich's bold honesty, Burr's quiet sorrow, the Lawton-Lanchester alliance, and Tyrone Power's secret duality, he saw a clear pattern. Hollywood was not just a place that made stars. It was a machine that created illusions. It rewarded those who could play along and punished those who couldn't. It turned pain into beauty, secrets into stories, and lies into legends. For Johnny, who spent decades talking to these people night after night, this contrast between what the world saw and what was really happening underneath never stopped fascinating him. He understood that every smile, every glamorous photo, every witty story told on his couch could be part of a much larger act. Behind the charm there was often loneliness, fear, and longing for acceptance. Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He was an observer of human nature. He knew that fame could protect people, but it could also destroy them. The same spotlight that made someone a star could also expose the cracks in their soul. These stories reminded him that no one, no matter how beautiful or talented, escaped the pressures of a system built on image. For every person who found a way to live truthfully, like Marlene Dietrich, there were others forced to live behind masks like Raymond Burr or Tyrone Power. Even James Dean's eternal youth was both a gift and a curse. His death preserved his myth, but it also silenced his truth. In the end, Carson saw Hollywood as a reflection of life itself, a place where truth and illusion were always intertwined. The actors who survived it learned to perform not just for the camera but for the world, and those performances sometimes lasted a lifetime.